I thought today I would talk about my jaunts in distribution. I want to cover distribution in several videos. I want to do one on the current state of distribution for indies, which is not very good. And then I'm also going to do some background on distribution as well, and a little bit on how films used to be distributed, and I'm going to cover that today because I'm going to be talking about theatrical distribution, because the first companies that I worked for were theatrical distributors, and they pretty much, that was all they did. You know, they didn't do that much video distribution at the time when I was there. And one of them even like had an arm that was beginning to develop, I remember. So anyway, let me talk about that. So the first job that I had in distribution was with Orion Pictures, which I'm sure you know Orion. You know, it's a distributor with a little O that then becomes Orion on the star field. I worked for Orion for a couple of years, and I was working out of the branch office in Detroit. This is back in the time when the major distributors did actually have state branch offices, and the branch office that I was in was also responsible for releasing in Ohio. So we pretty much covered Michigan and Ohio. And this was also a time when we had what was called hard tops, which were the theaters. And we also had the drive-ins, which were also called, Variety used to call them ozoners. So my job there was I was in booking. I also did some marketing, and I also did little jobs on the side, like kind of like moonlighting. Well, moonlighting for the company itself. I would go and do head counts in theaters because, you know, I guess we didn't necessarily trust that all the theaters that we had our films in were reporting honestly. And of course, some of them weren't, and some of them were, you know. Anyway, when I was at Orion, the films that I was involved in the distribution of were Class, Lone Wolf McQuade. Actually, let's go back and, well, Class was Andrew McCarthy, Rob Lowe, Jacqueline Bisset, and that film did pretty well, actually. Lone Wolf McQuade, which was the Chuck Norris movie, also involved with Strange Invaders, which was pretty much a flop for us, and Easy Money, the Rodney Dangerfield film. Rodney Dangerfield did have a few hit movies, and this was pretty much like his first starring movie, the first one where he was like headlining the movie. It didn't do all that well. A film that did much better for him later on was Back to School. But anyway, so I covered those movies. I think about 4 or 5 others as well, but my job was pretty much, you know, booking the movies into theatres and also going through the process of contracting the movies with the theatres. The theatres are mostly owned by corporations, and I was dealing with some of the bigger corporations like National Amusements, which in the Michigan area owned what was known as the Showcase theatres. They were called like Showcase, Sterling Heights. That was one of the ones that I attended myself, actually, and there was Showcase Sterling Heights, and there were Showcase theatres in other areas as well. But anyway, National Amusements, which is owned by Sumner Redstone, who then later on owned Viacom, that's where he started. He started as a theatre owner, so he owned National Amusements, and I used to occasionally deal with, I'd say maybe his second in charge, you know. I'll tell you something that was interesting about the theatrical scene those days is that we had the movies and we would announce we've got this film coming up, right? So if a theatre wanted to have what you would call an exclusive in their area, they would bid on a movie back then. So we'd screen the movie for them and send them publicity material. And then they'd decide whether they wanted to make a bid on the movie. And if they did do a bid on the movie, it meant that they had the movie exclusively in a certain area where their chain was. You know, and there was obviously limits to, you know, when a next chain would have the movie. But, you know, it might be, you know, if someone has, you know, outbid the other exhibitor on the movie, then that particular theatre chain would have the movie, whereas, for example, if there's one just down the down the road or around the block, that one wouldn't get that movie, or rather not yet, and might get it in second run. Because in those days you had a lot was first run. This is like pretty much pre-video. So you would have like first run, and then you would have second run, and then even third run. It was called pretty much like it was releasing a film like in a wave, and you'd have like, was called like first wave, second wave, third wave. And that's why sometimes you'd have films that would end up being on triple bills later on in their sort of like 7th or 8th week of release, because the smaller independent theatres would actually get a movie that has already played at the bigger theatre chains, and then the smaller theatres would actually get it, but then they might bill it with something else that they also had. You know, at the time they might put, one of our films with, say, Blue Thunder or, Space Hunter. They'd put that with something, even, something like Zombie Holocaust. You'd sometimes see very strange double bills where you'd actually have like one of the indie theatres has actually got like a studio film that's actually running with like, a rerun of Dawn of the Dead, something like that. There was a mixing of distributors, except when I worked in distribution in Australia, and when we would do double bills, we never mixed distributors. Like, certainly never mixed a film that was, say, for example, released by, say, UIP, which was like Universal and Paramount grouped together. That would never be with a Warner's movie. Back in those days, you had to be kind of careful, and you simply couldn't do it. You could not release a Warner's movie with a Universal movie in Australia, anyway. But in the US, it wasn't so much the case. Something that was kind of really interesting in the US was that we had this bidding situation, but you also had states, and the states were broken down into what was called a non-blind bidding state and a bidding state. And I was always curious, what does that mean, non-blind bidding state? Okay, this is what it meant. The states that were non-blind bidding meant that you couldn't just send the buyer at the theatre, the buyer, for example, for the theatre chain, you couldn't send them just a trailer, some stills, some PR, a synopsis, and expect them to bid on the movie based on that. You had to show them the whole movie, or at least a pretty decent cut of the movie. And I remember we didn't always show them what you would call would be a complete cut. There'd be effects missing or the credits missing. Anyway, because these people were bidding on the film sometimes 3 to 6 months out of the release, before it was released, they would bid on the movie, so you didn't always have something to show them, except you also had some states where you didn't have to do that. And so you had, if it was a non-blind bidding state, you had to show them the movie to get a bid. However, if it was not a non-blind bidding state, then they could actually bid on just the publicity material and the trailer. And also, I guess if it was a bad movie, they could bid on whatever hogwash you could tell them about the movie. And I'm sure, I don't really remember it happening that often with us, but I'm sure that the distributors probably like the states where, there was blind bidding, because half the time they're bidding on a poster. They're putting some money forward, they're advancing some money based on a poster, not necessarily watching the movie. Because if you watch the movie and see that the movie's a bunch of shit, then they're not going to bid on it, of course. Or it's certainly they're going to wait and see, or they're going to make a smaller bid. I mean, that was the situation. So the distribution of movies in those states my job was also pairing movies at drive-ins as well. So I worked at Orion, but I also worked for Village Roadshow then in Australia. And Village Roadshow was an interesting company because Village was their theatre chain, but Roadshow was their distribution chain. And they were run separately, but under the same roof. But there would be people there who would actually be the Roadshow guys, and there would be people who'd be like the Village people. Anyway, so I was a Village person. So I was hired under a few different, let's say I was hired with several job descriptions. I got the job because I'd worked in distribution in the US at Orion. So when the job was advertised, I went in there, and that was how I really got the job, because I'd actually just been working at Orion. And so I was also involved in acquisitions. So Village would also, it was a theatre chain, so they owned drive-ins, which were, again, we didn't call them ozoners in Australia, but they had drive-ins. And they also had hard tops, which were the cinemas. And I would be involved in acquisition. So at lunchtime, often we would take our lunch into the theaterette and we'd watch a film that was either an upcoming film that we were going to be putting into our theatres, or sometimes it'd be a film that we may be considering for distribution. And it was probably more roadshow that were going to be picking it up. So the roadshow people would be in there, and also the Village people as well. But, it was run, as I said, it was run literally under the same ceiling, but like two separate companies. So for example, when later on video started getting introduced, it was Roadshow Home Video, it wasn't Village Home Video. And I actually remember there was a guy there, it's like an old timer who'd been in the business for I think like 30, 40 years, his name was Jim. And I remember when the first VHSs of Roadshow's first ventures into the video business were presented. I remember old Jim looking at him and going, "Oh, look, no one's ever going to watch these. Who's going to watch these cassettes at home?" I think he was looking at a cassette of something like, I think it was like The Pursuit of DB Cooper, and there was a couple of Australian movies that were some of the first films that came out. But the distribution side and exhibition side were sort of mingled in Australia, whereas in the US, certainly not at the time when I was at Orion, there was not that much mingling of exhibition and distribution. I mean, they were quite separate. And that certainly changed later on. And I think there was actually a law that actually, endured, I think for several decades, is that, exhibitors and distributors were quite separate. Of course, not saying that things weren't discussed, weren't whispered, you do this, you do that. Because one of the main things back in those days is that when you were a distributor that had certain films that were attractive, of course, you'd always try to get them to keep the films that weren't doing so well in the theatres. Because usually the contracts that you were booking were about 6 weeks. So you were trying to get them to hold the films over for at least 6 weeks. But, what would sometimes happen is that the film would open and would get bad reviews, would flop. Monday morning, I'm getting phone calls, and the exhibitors, especially the indies, they wanted to drop the movie. I mean, even though there was already a 6-week contract, so then the contracts then would have to be amended, and it would be negotiated. Maybe you can get them to keep it in their theatre for maybe one more week, and then they'd say, okay, we'll keep it one more week, but we're going to move it to a smaller theatre. That's also something that was often negotiated, because they would want to, you would want them to put your movie into the largest theatre so you can maximise the audience. But often, if they were going to hold the film over, they would say, all right, we'll run it for another week, but we're going to put it in, our theatre that only seats 100 people, and take it out of the 300-seater and put one of our new movies into that. In most theatres, the position of all the publicity materials is pretty much negotiated, as is like where the trailers appear when you watch, 20 minutes of trailers before a movie. The movie that is the first trailer, there's a reason why that's there. It's negotiated, and same with the other trailers. So same with the placement of posters. Like you walk into a movie theatre and you see, the first poster you come to is the poster for this particular movie or that particular movie. That's negotiated, and the distributors have full-time people who travel around and talk to the exhibitors and try to get favourable positions for their films. So yeah, it's all negotiated. It might be $1,000 to put a poster there, and it's $200 to put a poster there, and then you also want to put cardboard standees in other areas. So yeah, it's all negotiated. I thought it was interesting for me to get to know that part of the industry because I was always more interested in the production side, even though I still really enjoyed the distribution side and I found it kind of fascinating. I then later on also then worked in a much kind of more focused capacity for a company called Exhibitors, which was David Lynch's company, in the release of a couple of films, which is Why Blue Yonder and no, that wasn't, of course, sorry. Yeah, some of the films that Exhibitors released, which was Herzog's Why Blue Yonder and also Lynch's Inland Empire. I was involved with my friend Norm Hill in the physical release of Inland Empire after it was cut down from a much, much longer movie to still a long movie, and was involved in the theatrical releases of the movie, like, New Art in Los Angeles or like Music Box in Chicago, that type of thing. But, I think it's important that when you're going to get into production, I think it really is important to understand the way that distribution works. And I thought here I would just cover more like the way that distribution used to work. And obviously theatrical distribution has even changed now. I mean, obviously no one's even shipping prints anymore. People are still shipping, now of course they're shipping, not even really shipping, but DCPs, which are digital cinema prints, which is really it's a digital file. There's still some film exhibition, which I think is great. I still love the texture of film, and there's just something about it being, there's something very solid and something very organic about real film. The added costs back in the days when we were shipping prints at Orion was that often, and the same at Village as well, often you didn't have enough prints for all the theatres. And it was funny because even like for drive-ins sometimes, you would do what was called bicycling prints. You might have, say 3 prints for 5 drive-ins. So then what you would do, you would actually have, on a particular night, you might have your main feature, which is the three prints that you have for your new movie. They all play first. Or you might stagger it, at one theatre, the support feature plays first and then you play that. But we would sometimes have one film finishing at one drive-in and then it would be picked up and quickly driven over to another drive-in so it could also then start in second position even though it was the main feature, and that was called bicycling prints. So there was all kinds of ways to make prints, make it look like there were more prints, because we didn't always produce that many, because it was very, very costly to produce a print. It was around, say, like, $2,000 to $4,000 to produce a film print. And on films, not so much on blockbusters, but on films that were more independent films, where you weren't spending as much on the entire release of the movie, you would actually be in a position where you would try to you would minimize the amount you're spending on the prints, and then you would be, bicycling prints, and and also you would also run into problems sometimes because you'd bicycle a print and someone who is driving the print, they get stuck in traffic, or their car would break down. So then that's why sometimes people would be at the drive-in thinking, how come the movie is taking so long to start? Because I remember these used to happen to me sometimes. They'd like have the first movie, and then you'd go and get your popcorn and your refreshments, and then you'd come back, and then there'd be 20 minutes where people would just be like, tooting their horns and flashing their lights at the drive-in screen, like, when's this thing going to start? And then, of course, later on, I realised that often what that was is that the person who was bicycling the print over to that drive-in was running late. So it was a very interesting time. Of course, you just don't have that issue with digital cinema prints, even though the digital cinema prints are still being brought to theatres, but it's getting to a point now where the theatres can upload the files, and it's obviously, to some extent, it's encrypted, so just not anybody can steal a digital cinema print, but they do, and there's always going to be that weak link in the middle where something gets stolen and something gets pirated. But yeah, it was a very different time then, and that was kind of like that pre-video time where you're really trying to maximize as much as you could from the print. And that's why sometimes you'd have prints that played for a year in certain markets. And there would always be some markets too. You'd have a film sometimes that would get released in, say you may have 30 prints that got released in, say, New York City in May, but then those same 30 prints then go do the rest of the country in June, July and August, which is why sometimes you'd have, you'd look at a newspaper, which I used to love reading, something like The Village Voice, and I'd say, oh, that film's opened, especially on art house releases. You'd see, oh, that film just opened, at 3 of the art house theaters in New York City, but then it would be 6 months later or 5 months later when it finally got to Detroit or somewhere like that. And that was wise because, there were only 3 prints that were like being used. And even when there was like 100 prints, they would go from market to market. There might be a release in 50 prints in New York City. 3 months later, there's 50 prints in LA, and it's making its way across the country. So you'd actually have sometimes a situation where it's literally being driven across the country, and that's kind of the release of the movie. You'd have like, okay, starts in New York City, then it's also then getting released in, in Houston, or it's getting released in somewhere like Arizona, eventually makes its way to like, Seattle or Portland, or makes its way to San Francisco, LA. And that's often the reason, because it's literally the transportation of the prints used to take a while, which doesn't happen now. And the reason to some extent it doesn't happen is, again, digital cinema prints, but also now because of privacy because of, actually not privacy, because of piracy, and also to maximize publicity, that when something is being promoted, say on the internet, and the money is being spent on that, everybody's seeing that. So it's kind of important then that if you're going to advertise a movie, it defeats a purpose if then, you've got broad advertising, digital advertising, but then you see that it's not playing at your cinemas. Not like the old days where, 6 months later it's coming. That didn't happen then. And of course then you didn't have so much national advertising for a lot of movies, that what you actually had, you would have regional advertising for certain movies. So next time I want to talk about the current state of distribution for indie movies, which is at the moment, I think it's really perilous, but I've got a few suggestions and a few ideas. So let's catch up then. As I said earlier, hit the like button and subscribe if you like this.